House on Millbrook Drive had a back porch that faced east, and every summer morning when I was a kid, my grandmother would sit out there with her coffee before anyone else woke up. Just her and the yard and the light coming through the oak trees in that slow golden way it does in late June. I used to sneak downstairs sometimes, and she'd move over on the bench without saying a word, and we'd just sit there together. She never made me feel like I was interrupting something. That porch was where I learned that silence between two people could be the most comfortable thing in the world. My grandmother passed on a Tuesday in March. She was 81, her name was Ruth, and she had outlived my grandfather by 14 years, and had done it with more grace than most people manage their good years. She had a small savings account, a paid off house in Millbrook, a few pieces of jewelry that had been her mother's, and a storage unit outside of town that nobody had opened in probably a decade. Not a fortune. But to our family, it meant something. It was hers, and she had worked for every bit of it, and she had been very clear about what she wanted done with it. I found out she was sick in January. My mother called me on a Sunday evening, and I could tell from the first 2 seconds of the call that it wasn't a routine check in. My grandmother had been declining for a while, her memory mostly, but this was different. The doctors were talking about a matter of weeks. I drove down the following weekend. I live about 4 hours away in Columbus, Ohio. I'm a paralegal, have been for 6 years, and I work for a small firm that handles mostly estate and probate cases. I know what the paperwork looks like. I know what the propose is supposed to look like. That matters for later. My brother flew in from Portland. He's 3 years older than me, 34, and we have never been particularly close in the way that some siblings are. We don't fight, we don't have some dramatic history. We just became very different people, and the distance, literal and otherwise, had grown over the years without either of us doing much to stop it. His wife came with him. She is the kind of person who is always slightly performing, always angled toward how things look rather than how they are. I don't say that to be cruel, it's just the most accurate description I have. That first weekend, we were all focused on my grandmother. She had good days and bad days. On her good days, she knew exactly who we were and she wanted to talk about things she hadn't thought about in years. Old neighbors, recipes, a trip she and my grandfather had taken to the Smoky Mountains sometime in the 1970s. On her bad days, she was somewhere else entirely, and the best you could do was hold her hand and be in the room with her. My brother started asking questions about the house on the second day, not outright, not in a way I could point to directly. He mentioned, almost in passing, whether my mother had thought about what came next, logistically, whether the property taxes were current, whether my grandmother had done any updates to her will recently. I watched my mother feel these questions with the kind of patience that comes from exhaustion, and I didn't say anything. I told myself he was just being practical. People deal with grief in different ways. Some people need to feel like they're doing something, solving something, and so they reach for the logistics because it's easier than just sitting with the laws. But something stayed with me. 2 weeks later, my grandmother passed on a Tuesday afternoon. My mother was there. I was driving down when I got the call, and I pulled over on the side of I-71 and I sat there for a while before I kept going. When I got to Millbrook, my brother and his wife were already there. He had apparently driven through the night from the airport. In the days that followed, I was the one handling most of the arrangements. Not because anyone asked me to, it just felt that way. My mother was in no state to make phone calls, and my brother was present in the house, but in that particular way where someone is there without really being available. His wife spent a lot of time on her phone. I called the funeral home, I called my grandmother's attorney, I started the preliminary process for probate because I knew what needed to happen and I knew the timeline. The will had been updated 2 years prior. My grandmother had done it with a local attorney she had used for decades, a retired man named Howard Bellamy, who had known her since the 80s. She had left the house and the bulk of her savings split between my mother and me. My brother received a smaller portion. There was no malice in it. My grandmother had told me directly the year before that she had already helped him out significantly during his divorce proceedings, and she wanted things to feel fair in the long run. The jewelry went to me individually. The storage unit contents were to be sorted and divided. My brother did not take this well. He didn't explode. He didn't make a scene at the attorney's office, not exactly. But there was a shift in him that I could feel in the room. He became very quiet in that specific way that isn't really quiet, it's more like compression, like something building pressure. That evening, he pulled my mother aside for a long time. I don't know exactly what was said. What I do know is that my mother came to me afterward looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with grief and said, "He's very upset about the house." I said I understood that it was a lot to process. My mother said, "He says grandma told him something different years ago." I didn't have a response for that. People say a lot of things years ago, and memories are convenient. I let it go for the moment. Over the next several days, my brother's questions got more specific. He asked my mother if she had access to the savings account yet. He asked me whether the probate process could be expedited. He mentioned twice in two separate conversations that he was dealing with some financial pressure back in Portland. Nothing he elaborated on, just enough to put it on the table. His wife started talking about the house in a way that felt like she was already rearranging the furniture in her head, mentioning that the Portland housing market was brutal and that it was so nice my grandmother had kept the place in such good condition. I started paying attention differently. I'm not someone who immediately assumes the worst about people. I wasn't walking around that week thinking my brother was planning something. But I have spent 6 years in an office where the entire job is watching what happens to families when someone dies and there's money involved. And I have seen the pattern enough times that some part of my brain just starts noting things without my permission. I called Howard Bellamy. He was retired, but he had been close to my grandmother and he was willing to talk. I asked him whether my brother had been in contact with him at any point. He paused for a moment and then said, carefully, that yes, my brother had reached out to him the prior spring. My brother had asked about the will. Howard had told him only that a will existed and that its contents would be disclosed at the appropriate time. My brother had pressed him on whether the house was included. Howard had declined to discuss specifics. That phone call changed something in me. I went back to my grandmother's bank the following morning. My mother had been named joint account holder on one of my grandmother's checking accounts, a practical arrangement they had set up years ago so that my mother could help with bills when my grandmother's mobility became limited. The account had a moderate balance, not the main savings, but not nothing. The account required both signatories for withdrawals above a certain threshold. My mother didn't know this. She had never had occasion to test it, but I knew because I had helped set it up, and I remembered. I spent 2 evenings going through my grandmother's financial records. She kept paper copies of everything in a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, organized by year, going back to 1987. I found a withdrawal request that had been submitted to the bank 3 days prior. It was in an amount just below the joint threshold. The signature on the request was my mother's. Except my mother had been at the funeral home when that request was submitted, finalizing arrangements. I had been with her. I called my mother and asked her, very calmly, whether she had initiated any transactions from grandma's account in the last week. She said no. I sat with that for a day. Then I called my firm, not as an employee. I called my supervising attorney, a woman named Rennie who has been practicing estate law for over 20 years. I laid out everything I had, the will, the timeline, the withdrawal request, the signature. She listened without interrupting me once, and when I finished, she said quietly, "You know what this is." I said I thought I did. She said, "What do you want to do?" I told her I needed one business day. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept going over the details, kept checking my own certainty. Because there is a version of this where I was wrong. There is always a version where you're wrong. And the cost of being wrong about your own brother is not a small thing. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about the porch and the oak trees and the coffee and the silence, and I thought about what my grandmother would have wanted. And I thought about the fact that the signature on that withdrawal request was not my mother's handwriting, and I had known my mother's handwriting since I was 7 years old. The next morning, I went to the bank. I spoke with the branch manager and I explained the situation. I had documentation. I had the timeline. I had my mother's signed statement that she had not authorized the transaction. The manager was professional and thorough, and she put a hold on all accounts associated with my grandmother's estate pending review. I also notified the probate court, per Renee's guidance, that there was a potential irregularity. That afternoon, I found a flight booked under my brother's name. I didn't go looking for it. His wife had mentioned in a conversation the evening before that they had to get back to Portland soon for something with her job. Standard enough. Except the flight she mentioned, when I looked it up by the approximate time and date she had referenced, was not to Portland. It was to Cancun. My brother and his wife left 2 days after my grandmother's funeral. I drove them to the airport. My brother hugged me before he went through security. He seemed lighter than he had been all week, easier in his posture. He said to take care of my mother. He said he'd call when he landed. He texted me from the gate, about to board. Love you. I read that text standing in the airport parking garage and I didn't write back right away. I just drove home. I was in the kitchen of my grandmother's house that evening, washing a coffee mug, one of hers, the one she always used, blue with a white rim, when my phone buzzed. My brother. Transfer request is in, should clear tomorrow or next day. Let us know how everything goes with the house. I put the mug down on the counter. I had moved the balance the previous morning. Everything that could legally be moved into a secure estate holding account, done in coordination with Howard Bellamy, fully documented, filed with the court. The account my brother thought he was pulling from had been at a zero balance since 9 a.m. the day before. I wrote back, safe travels. 3 days later, my brother called me from what I assumed was Cancun. Though he didn't say where he was not light anymore. He was not easy in his posture, I could hear it. He asked me what had happened with the account. I told him the estate assets were secured pending probate review and that he'd want to talk to an attorney. He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means exactly what it sounds like." He started to say something about misunderstandings, about things being complicated, about how he had just needed a short-term bridge. As if there were a version of this conversation where that was a reasonable explanation. I let him finish. Then I said, "The bank has the documentation. The court has been notified. I'd really recommend you talk to an attorney before you come back." He didn't call again for 2 weeks. What happened next, I'll be honest, took longer than I wanted it to. These things always do. The probate process moved at its own pace. The bank investigation had its own timeline. And there were weeks where I was fielding calls from my mother, who was caught somewhere between grief and disbelief, and the particular exhaustion of having to reckon with who her son had apparently become. There were nights when I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. There were nights when I just missed my grandmother and wished none of this had happened. But here's what I kept coming back to. My grandmother had sat across from Howard Bellamy 2 years before she died, and she had updated that will with full clarity on what she was doing. She had made deliberate choices. She had thought about fairness and about history and about what she wanted to mean to the people she was leaving behind. She had not been confused or manipulated or pressured. She had known exactly what she was doing, and she had trusted that the people she was leaving things to would handle it the way she would have wanted. I was not going to let that be undone. The house on Millbrook Drive is still in the family. The porch still faces east. The oak trees are still there. Last October, I drove down and sat out there in the morning with a cup of coffee, and the light came through the way it always did, and it was almost unbearably familiar. Not the grief exactly, not the anger about everything that had happened, but something quieter. The weight of having been the person who showed up, of having done the thing that needed doing, even when it cost something. My grandmother used to say that the true test of a person isn't how they act when things are easy, it's how they act when they think no one is watching. She was right. She usually was. I still have the blue mug with the white rim. I use it every morning. I've thought a lot about what made my brother do what he did. Not in a bitter way, not anymore. More like the way you turn something over in your hands trying to understand the shape of it. He isn't a monster. He's someone who spent years making small compromises with himself, borrowing against tomorrow, telling himself he'd fix it later, letting the pressure build until the moment someone died. And suddenly there was money within reach and his judgment just collapsed completely. I watched it happen in real time, and I still didn't want to believe it. That's the part nobody talks about. It's not the betrayal itself that stays with you. It's the days before, when you're still giving someone the benefit of the doubt, still telling yourself you're misreading things, still choosing generosity of interpretation over what your gut is already telling you clearly. I did that for almost a week. And I think that's human. But there's a cost to it. And the cost is that sometimes the person you're protecting from your own suspicion is already in the process of hurting you. What I keep coming back to is this: I was prepared, not because I'm cynical or because I expected the worst from my own family. I was prepared because I paid attention, because I knew how the process worked, because I'd spent 6 years watching what grief does to people when money is involved, and I'd filed that knowledge away without ever thinking I'd need it for myself. And then I needed it. The preparation wasn't paranoia. It was the result of having taken my work seriously, of having learned things thoroughly enough that when the moment came, I didn't have to scramble. I already knew what to do that matters, not just in the practical sense, but in a deeper one. The things you learn, really learn, not just skim, become a kind of protection, not against bad things happening because bad things happen regardless, but against being helpless when they do. My grandmother worked hard her entire life and kept meticulous records in a filing cabinet going back to 1987. She didn't do that because she was paranoid either. She did it because she understood that clarity and documentation are a form of respect for yourself, for the people you love, for the truth of what actually happened. I found out what she understood about that the hard way. The morning after I secured the accounts, I sat on her porch with coffee and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, exactly, more like steadiness. Like I had done the thing that needed doing and the ground under me was solid. My brother was somewhere sunny and expensive, about to discover that the account he thought he was pulling from had been empty since 9 in the morning the day before. And I wasn't celebrating that. I was just sitting there in the quiet with her mug in my hands, thinking about how she had trusted me to handle things right. And I had. That's what I want to carry forward from all of this. Not the anger, not the grief about what my brother chose to become, not even the satisfaction of the outcome. Just that feeling of having been the person who showed up, of having done the right thing not because it was easy or painless, but because it was right. Ruth deserved that. She earned it. And the least I could do was make sure it meant something.